Just after noon, on August 29th, 2010, a man pulled into a gas station near the northeastern edge of the city of Nashville, Tennessee. He was on his way to his girlfriend's house nearby, but decided to stop to fill up his car and purchase some snacks and drinks, as the pair had planned a weekend trip to a state park. Though this detour took just a few minutes, it would turn out to be incredibly consequential. This is because at that very moment, a horrifying crime was unfolding, one in which this narrow window of time would play a pivotal role. While the case would initially frustrate and baffle investigators, as they continued to dig deeper, disturbing details would soon emerge. By the time it was all over, multiple lives would be ruined, and a plot would be exposed that was so chilling, no one wanted to believe it. By all accounts, Veronica Bozza was the kind of person who wasn't afraid to pursue the things in life that she was passionate about. Originally from Milan, Italy, at the age of 23, she left behind everything she had known up until that point and moved to the United States, with the goal of pursuing a career in the entertainment industry. In particular, she dreamed of being a television producer. After landing an entry-level job in the industry, right away, Veronica began to impress those around her. She took to the work quickly, and her seemingly endless energy and enthusiasm helped her to connect with others almost instantly. Colleagues and friends described her as a beam of light, the kind of person that you wanted to work with and couldn't help but love and respect. A few theorized that it was her devout religious faith as a Catholic that made her so sweet, kind, and willing to help others. Despite steadfastly pursuing her dreams, Veronica was careful to never make her life completely about work. She married her husband, Tim Bozza, in 1994, and 7 years later, they welcomed a little boy into the world. With the birth of Veronica's son, her life felt more full than ever. That being said, the next few years were a mixed bag for Veronica. Raising her son continued to be the greatest joy of her life, but eventually, things started to become strained in her marriage. Unfortunately, like with many relationships, financial issues started to drive the couple apart. At the forefront of their problems were Veronica and Tim's opposing career trajectories. When they had first gotten together, Tim was a successful contractor who owned a business remodeling and selling homes. Over the years, though, he had fallen on hard times, and some of the financial decisions he had made reportedly put the family in jeopardy. Veronica's career, meanwhile, was only getting better. She had worked her way up as a producer and was now becoming known as a rising star in the industry. In 2009, after 15 years of marriage, the relationship came to an end. As sad as this was, for roughly the next year, Veronica and Tim did their best to co-parent their now 8-year-old son. However, just when it seemed like everything might be getting to a new normal, a tragedy came out of nowhere that would leave everyone reeling. August 29th, 2010, started out like any other Sunday for Veronica Bozza. That morning, she and her son made the roughly 20-minute drive from her home in Nashville's Hermitage neighborhood and attended Mass at St. Edward's Catholic Church. The pair were well known here, as Veronica was actively involved in church activities, and her son attended the adjacent Catholic school. Nobody there noticed anything out of the ordinary that day, and both Veronica and her son were acting completely normally. The service ended around 11:30 a.m., with the two of them leaving about 5 to 10 minutes later. Veronica then dropped off her son with Tim at the parking lot of a nearby grocery store, where they had agreed to meet as part of their ongoing shared custody agreement. After that, she started heading back home. On the way, Veronica would make 3 phone calls. Sadly, she had no way of knowing that these would later become of immense importance, because as it turned out, they would be the last phone calls the 39-year-old would ever make. The first call was to her boyfriend, Brian Robinson. Like Veronica, Brian was a television producer, and the pair had met while working on a show together. The relationship was fairly new. They had only been dating for 2 to 3 months, but they had quickly fallen for one another. When they spoke, it was just after 11:50 a.m., and they discussed their plans for the day. They were going to take a trip to Fall Creek Falls, a state park that is home to one of the highest waterfalls in the eastern United States. Since it was about a 2-hour journey, Brian decided that he would stop at a gas station on the way to Veronica's house to fuel up and grab them some snacks and drinks for the drive. The last 2 calls that Veronica made both went to voicemail. The first message she left was for her sister Lorenza at 12:01 p.m. The final call and message was to her friend Garnett between 12:07 and 12:08. Both women would later say that it sounded like Veronica was driving in her car when she had made the calls. Just 12 minutes later, Brian pulled into the driveway of Veronica's house. What was waiting for him inside was truly the stuff of nightmares. At approximately 12:30 p.m. that day, Nashville police received a frantic 911 call. The caller identified himself as Brian Robinson and said that he needed immediate help at his girlfriend's house in Hermitage. When officers arrived at the residence, they encountered an unsettling scene. The garage and front doors to the property were both open, and inside, there were obvious signs of disarray. Curtains had been pulled down in the living room, chairs were overturned, and cushions on a nearby couch were out of place. All of it led straight to a chilling crime scene. On the living room floor was Veronica Bozza. She was lying in a pool of blood and had no vital signs. Sadly, she could not be saved. An autopsy would soon reveal that Veronica had been shot several times, with the final fatal bullet striking her in the head. Whoever had done this was determined to make sure that she was dead. Gut-wrenchingly, it appeared that she had fought for her life. Powder burns to one of her hands suggested that she had tried to grab the gun away from the killer as they shot. Following the disheveled path of items in the house, authorities went outside to the unclosed garage. Inside was Veronica's vehicle, whose driver's side door was also wide open. Her purse was still on the passenger seat, though items from inside, including her sunglasses, were strewn across the garage floor. Her white iPhone was nowhere to be found. Based on these details, authorities were able to piece together what they believed were Veronica's final, terrifying moments. It appeared that she had been followed home and ambushed on her driveway as she was still preparing to get out of her car. She had managed to run from the vehicle and make it inside, but the chase had ended in the living room, where Veronica had tragically been shot to death. While taking a closer look at the crime scene, investigators uncovered their first major clues. Jewelry that was out in the open had been left untouched, as had an envelope on a nearby counter that contained $400 in cash, as well as a blank check. It seemed to suggest that robbery was not the motive behind the killing. At the same time, no murder weapon was found at the scene, and the killer had gone to the trouble of picking up the spent shell casings from the gun in an obvious attempt to cover their tracks. Luckily for detectives, though, the perpetrator hadn't been as thorough as they had thought. A lone shell casing had been left behind, having landed out of view, tucked near the baseboards of one of the living room walls. Once recovered, the shell casing was sent off for testing. With an explanation of how the crime had unfolded now coming together, authorities next needed to try and understand the who and the why. And as far as they were concerned, there was at least one obvious place to start. Since Brian Robinson was both Veronica's boyfriend and the person to discover her body, he was the first person to be questioned in connection with her murder. However, he was far too overwhelmed at the crime scene to give police much more than basic details, so a follow-up interview was scheduled. In the meantime, detectives followed up on another potential lead. It turned out that just a few months prior to her death, Veronica had been the victim of a mugging. The culprit had been armed and had robbed Veronica, though disturbingly, police learned that he was scheduled to be released on parole. Based on this, investigators believed it was possible that the shooting could have been some sort of warped revenge crime. However, when they looked further into it, this theory was eliminated. The mugger had yet to actually be released from custody at the time of the murder. With this suspect eliminated, detectives brought Brian in for a formal interview. They asked him about the events of the day of the murder, and he explained that he had come to Veronica's house that afternoon to pick her up for their trip to Fall Creek Falls. He said that when he pulled into the driveway, he could immediately tell something was off because of the open garage and front door. When he went inside to investigate, he said he saw Veronica lying on the living room floor. He screamed out her name, but when he noticed the blood, he immediately knew that she was dead. This last comment piqued the interest of detectives. They thought it was weird that Brian was so sure that Veronica was gone when they knew from the audio of his 911 call that he hadn't tried to perform any life-saving measures on her before emergency workers arrived. In fact, he hadn't checked to see if she was breathing or if she had a pulse until prompted to by dispatchers. Once he did, Brian admitted that he had also washed his hands before police had arrived. The reason all of this stood out to investigators was because by now they had taken a look at Veronica's call records from the day of the murder. They showed that she had been alive as late as 12:08 p.m., when she had left the final voicemail for her friend. Based on when Brian said he had arrived at the house at 12:20 p.m., this left an incredibly narrow 12-minute window in which the crime had to have occurred. This being the case, detectives were beginning to wonder whether Brian really had just missed the culprit, or whether there was something he wasn't telling them. For his part, though, Brian denied any involvement in the crime. He was extremely emotional during questioning, saying that despite the brief time he and Veronica had been together, he had never felt so strongly about a relationship. He said that he had never been loved the way that Veronica had loved him, and that they had been making plans for the future. Besides, he said, there was another suspect that he felt detectives should be looking into: Veronica's soon-to-be ex-husband, Tim Bozza. According to Brian, though Veronica and Tim had been doing their best to make it seem like things between them were amicable for the benefit of their son, privately, things were extremely contentious. In the 14 months since their separation, things had degenerated, and divorce proceedings had been riddled with arguments over the settlement as well as child custody. Though the divorce was close to being finalized at the time of Veronica's murder, Brian said that Tim in particular had been unhappy with how things had played out, especially after the courts had recently granted Veronica more time with their son. He further stated that Veronica herself had been wary of Tim, and that they both thought he might be capable of terrible things. In particular, Brian stated that Tim was still having money issues, and they worried he might do something desperate. At the end of the interview, authorities still didn't feel that they had enough to rule Brian out as a suspect, but they did believe that his grief over Veronica's death seemed genuine. While some officers were sent to check the accuracy of Brian's alibi, detectives next turned their attention to Tim Bozza. When authorities first visited Tim at his home, they found his demeanor suspicious, especially because he didn't seem all that upset over the news of Veronica's death. However, this changed when the conversation moved to the topic of their son. Faced with the prospect of having to explain what had happened to the boy's mother, Tim became visibly shaken and emotional. After bringing him in for a formal interview, investigators asked him for his side of things when it came to his relationship with Veronica. He claimed that what they had heard up until that point had been wildly overblown. Sure, he was upset about what had happened between them, but he claimed that was mostly because he never wanted to get divorced in the first place. He said that they had tried therapy for a while and that it hadn't worked. He chalked a lot of it up to Veronica's work schedule. She spent so much time away from their home that they had inevitably drifted apart. Though Tim appeared to be calm and collected in the interview, detectives wanted to see how he would respond under direct questioning. They said that they knew he was having financial troubles and also dropped another bit of information they had uncovered. Veronica had a life insurance policy for $550,000, and Tim was the beneficiary. Tim responded adamantly that he was not involved and acknowledged the life insurance policy. However, he claimed that he wasn't even sure if this still applied, because Veronica's policy was supposed to change as part of the divorce. When asked about his movements on the day of the crime, Tim said that he had met Veronica to pick up their son shortly before noon at the spot near the church as they had planned. After that, he had gone to 2 different stores near his home in the small city of Ridgetop, just north of Nashville. He provided receipts for both locations. The first, from a grocery store, showed a time of 12:35 p.m., while the second, from a hardware store, showed 1:19 p.m. Detectives looked into Tim's alibi and were able to recover surveillance footage from both stores. Everything matched up just the way that he had said. Based on the 12-minute window of time in which Veronica was killed, and the more than 30-minute driving distance from Hermitage to Ridgetop, there was no way that Tim could have been at the crime scene that day. At roughly the same time that detectives received this information, they got word that Brian's alibi had also checked out. There was surveillance footage of him at the gas station buying the drinks and snacks at 12:15 p.m., which meant that he had been telling the truth. With all of their most compelling suspects accounted for, it looked like investigators were now at a dead end. Realizing that they needed to pursue new leads in the case, detectives canvassed Veronica's neighborhood and asked residents if they had seen anything suspicious in the area around the time of the crime that might have been overlooked. A couple of people were able to provide information that they thought might be of use. An SUV had been parked in the alleyway close to Veronica's house near the time of the murder. Witnesses thought that it could have been white, silver, or some other kind of light metallic color. At the same time, ballistics information came back about the single shell casing that had been recovered from the scene. It had been fired from a high-point 9mm handgun. The most promising new lead, however, came when investigators decided to pull the full cell phone records for Veronica's iPhone, including GPS data. Since the phone had not been present at the crime scene, they theorized that it might have been taken by the killer. Sure enough, when detectives looked at the GPS data, they saw that the phone had traveled with Veronica to church that morning, to the parking lot where she had met Tim, and then back to her home. However, after that, things got interesting. Immediately following Veronica's murder, the iPhone had started moving again. It pinged cell towers heading back west towards the interstate before the signal finally went dead. To detectives, this was confirmation that the killer had taken Veronica's phone. Sensing that they were onto something, investigators next obtained the same records for Brian Robinson and Tim Bozza's devices. Once again, the GPS data supported the information that both men had given to police. However, one thing did stand out in the call records. That day, Tim had called the same number at least 13 times both before and after picking up his son. The number belonged to a man named Corey Cotham. After discovering the abnormally large amount of calls Tim Bozza had made to the same number on August 29th, authorities decided to look further into Corey Cotham. When they did, they learned that Corey was a mutual friend of Tim and Veronica's, and had actually lived with them for a brief period around a decade prior. Since then, Tim and Corey had not only stayed close friends, but had also become business partners. However, this wasn't all that police uncovered about Corey. It turned out that he also had a less than stellar reputation. While Corey considered himself something of a ladies' man, going by the nickname Big Man, he had a troubling history of assaults against women. Several people he had been involved with also said that he was the kind of guy who was always trying to get money off of them. Just like with all the other people of interest in the case so far, detectives were able to obtain Corey's cell phone records. When they began poring over the associated GPS data, red flags immediately went up. Corey's phone had not only been in the vicinity of St. Edward's Catholic Church on the morning of the murder, but later on, it had also been near Veronica's house. Even more chilling, following Veronica's murder, in the brief window of time when her iPhone was still active, it completely matched the movements of Corey's cell phone. Though their suspicions were definitely piqued, when detectives brought Corey in for questioning, they decided not to immediately confront him with what they knew. Instead, they told him that he was merely there to corroborate Tim Bozza's alibi. Investigators asked Corey about the day of the murder, and he told them that in the morning he had been driving back to Tennessee from Kentucky, where he had been hanging out with one of his girlfriends the previous night. He said that he had been back in town at the time Veronica was killed, but that he had been with another woman by that time that he was seeing, named Jenny. He said that they had spent most of the day together. Of course, authorities knew that Corey was lying, but before they revealed this, they wanted to determine one final thing. They asked him if his cell phone was the best way to reach him. Corey replied that he always had the device on him, and further confirmed that it had been with him at all times on August 29th. This is what detectives had been after. It showed not only that Corey was lying, but also established by his own account that his phone could be used to accurately trace his movements on the day of the crime. When detectives revealed that they had already seen Corey's cell records and that they knew he wasn't telling the truth, he immediately became angry and denied any involvement in Veronica's murder. By this time, it didn't matter though. Police had more than enough to obtain further search warrants to look through his cell phone and vehicle. Both would soon reveal a wealth of new information. After obtaining their search warrants, authorities started with Corey Cotham's vehicle. It turned out that Corey drove a champagne-colored Cadillac Escalade, an SUV that matched the approximate size and color description of the vehicle witnesses told detectives had been parked near Veronica's house around the time of her murder. The vehicle's interior contained a number of items, though most of these initially seemed fairly ordinary, such as a pair of sunglasses, a phone charging cord, a towel, and a red collapsible lunch bag. Even the items that were slightly more suspicious weren't outwardly incriminating, however. These included a black sleeve mask and latex gloves, which Corey claimed that he used for his job since he regularly had to work with chemicals. Things started coming together, though, when investigators began searching through Corey's phone. After looking into one of the numbers that he had called on the day of the crime, they were led to one of Corey's former neighbors. The man said that a couple of weeks prior, he had asked for help cleaning a handgun. Not just any handgun, though. A high .9mm. The neighbor also recalled one other crucial detail. He said that Corey had brought the weapon over inside of a red collapsible lunch bag, the very same lunch bag that had been found in the back of Corey's SUV. As bad as things were now looking for Corey Cotham, detectives knew that they were still facing a couple of major roadblocks if they were going to bring an ironclad case against him. First, they needed to prove definitively that the 9mm Corey had been in possession of was the actual weapon that had been used to kill Veronica Bozza. And second, they needed to fully dismantle Corey's alibi. As it happened, there was one person who could help investigators to do both. While detectives were already convinced that Corey Cotham was lying to them about his movements on the day of the murder thanks to the GPS data from his cell phone, there was still a potential problem facing them when it came to his alibi. That problem was Jenny, the woman who he claimed he had been with at the time of the crime and whom so far had backed up his story. She said that they had been eating lunch together at her house. When authorities initially tried to confront Jenny with the cell phone data proving that she and Corey were lying, she was evasive. She called a lawyer and refused to speak to police further. This was frustrating for detectives until Jenny had an apparent change of heart. She reached out to investigators herself and said that she was now ready to talk. In a subsequent interview, Jenny admitted that she had lied about Corey's alibi. He had come to her house at some point that afternoon, but she couldn't say with any certainty when that actually was. What was far more interesting, however, was the reason Jenny said that she had been hesitant to speak with police before. You see, she had stolen her ex-husband's handgun a little while ago and was worried that she was going to get into legal trouble. That's when a series of bombshell revelations started coming. Not only was the stolen handgun a high .9mm, but Jenny had hidden it in a red collapsible lunch bag after she had taken it and put it in her vehicle. By the time Jenny decided that she needed to return the gun to her ex, she realized that both the bag and the handgun were now missing. The only person who had access to her vehicle during that time other than her was Corey Cotham. When authorities spoke with Jenny's ex-husband, they were able to confirm her story about the stolen handgun. He had actually filed a police report over the missing weapon and had suspected that Jenny was responsible for taking it. The ex-husband also volunteered one more thing that he thought could be helpful. He said that he had fired the handgun many times on his property and said that if investigators wanted to come and have a look for other casings from the weapon, they were more than welcome to. After a long search, forensic techs were able to recover 2 of these casings. Ballistics analysis confirmed that they had come from the same firearm that had killed Veronica Bozza. As the final icing on the cake, authorities recovered a deleted image while searching Corey Cotham's phone. It was a picture he had taken of the missing murder weapon. The discovery couldn't have come at a better time, because not long after, investigators got an alarming call from Jenny. After sharing all of the information that she had with police, Jenny had also agreed to work with detectives as a show of good faith that she wasn't in any way involved in Veronica's murder. The deal proved to be advantageous when she gave police another call out of the blue. She had just learned that Corey was planning to flee the country. He was going to try and leave the United States and head for Barbados. Realizing that they were now working against the clock, detectives asked Jenny to come in and do a recorded call with Corey so that they could uncover as much information as possible about his plans. They also theorized that he might let valuable information about the murder slip in his panicked state. Their intuition would prove to be correct. During the call, Jenny pretended like she was now being arrested and told Corey that the police knew everything. She also said that they had tied the murder weapon to him. That's when Corey made 2 crucial errors. First, he dismissed what Jenny had to say about the ballistics evidence, saying that the bullets could have been fired from any 9mm handgun. The thing was, though, no one had actually said that it was a 9mm handgun that police had connected to Corey, nor had this information been released to the public. He had just unwittingly revealed a detail only the killer would know. Corey's second mistake was even more alarming. He told Jenny that she needed to get in contact with Tim Bozza. Up until now, detectives had had their suspicions about Tim. After all, even though almost all the evidence had pointed at Corey Cotham, it was clear that Tim was the one with the actual motive for wanting Veronica dead. With that, authorities moved in on both men. Tim was easy enough to find, while Corey was located thanks to Jenny's help. Once in custody, Corey refused to speak with investigators. Tim, however, was remarkably candid. The information that he shared was truly horrifying. Tim explained that everything that had happened with Veronica's murder had been the result of a twisted plot that he and Corey had cooked up together one day at work. Both men had been resentful towards people in their lives. He and Veronica had been going through their contentious divorce, and Corey was angry about an ex-husband of one of his girlfriends who was living with his son. They joked that it would be great if they could take care of each other's problems, with Tim referring to it as a, quote, Criss-Cross situation. He would kill the ex-husband, and Corey would kill Veronica. Disturbingly, Tim said that they had gotten their inspiration from the 1987 movie Throw Mama from the Train, in which actors Danny DeVito and Billy Crystal are in a similar situation. At the same time, Tim claimed that he never actually intended to go through with the plan, and that he thought they were simply joking about the whole thing to blow off some steam. He said that he didn't know what had happened until after it was over, and Corey informed him that Veronica was dead. He stated that afterwards, Corey had asked him for $35,000 of the $550,000 payout he was supposed to get from Veronica's life insurance policy. Detectives, however, had a hard time believing Tim's claims of ignorance. For starters, he had clearly been in constant contact with Corey on the day of the crime. The timing of the murder, they believed, had also been no coincidence. Corey had known exactly where and when to find Veronica after the custody exchange, giving him enough time to follow her home and carry out the shooting, while Tim made sure he went somewhere where he could establish an alibi. Finally, when police spoke with Tim and Veronica's financial advisor, he said that at Veronica's funeral, Tim had immediately approached him about the life insurance policy he was expecting. It turned out that it had been far from the ambiguous situation that Tim had initially told detectives. He knew that once the divorce was finalized, he would no longer get the $555,000 if something happened to Veronica. If he wanted the money, he would have known he needed to act fast. Though Tim and Corey were tried separately for their roles in Veronica's murder, the prosecution laid out the same case in both trials. They argued that Tim was bitter about his divorce and was in a dire financial situation, so had made the deal with Corey to commit the so-called Criss-Cross murder. In exchange, Tim had also agreed to pay Corey $35,000 from Veronica's life insurance policy. That day, Corey had followed Veronica home from church, parked his vehicle nearby, then ambushed her on the driveway armed with the gun and wearing the black sleeve mask and latex gloves. She had tried to run inside and get to safety, but sadly, Corey had chased her before callously carrying out her murder. In 2012, Tim Bozza and Corey Cotham were both found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. Corey was additionally found guilty of especially aggravated robbery. Tim was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for 51 years, while Corey received a sentence of life without parole. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.